Good day. First, a brief announcement. Today I will be driving north to England's Peak District to give myself a short break, enjoying the fresh air, the countryside, hopefully doing some walking. My children and my dogs and of course and my wife will all be with us. With me. Now, having said that, over the next couple of days, I will try to continue to provide you with regular updates of the situation in Ukraine and in terms of the global crisis, but I may not be able to do so to the same extent as I have up to now, and there may be some days when I'm afraid I just won't be able to, either because I'm doing other things or because I find myself in a place where there's less internet connections. Having said that, as I said, I do intend, to the extent that I can, to keep up my regular updates over this period. They don't take me a huge amount of time to do, except of course the amount of time I have to do researching them is enormous, but that's another matter. In the meantime, I will also today be driving north, and I'm afraid that reduces my amount of time today, and therefore this update this time is indeed going to be relatively short. Briefly, we had information yesterday, lots of claims yesterday about a Ukrainian counterattack in the town of Severodonetsk, which previously we'd heard was in the residential areas of which had come under Russian control. And there's no doubt that the Ukrainians did indeed launch some kind of counterattack in Severodonetsk, and the Ukrainian governor of Lugansk region actually came out and said that the Ukrainians had recaptured around 20% of the town, leaving them in control of around 50% of the town. And clearly in coordination with the Ukrainian authorities and in anticipation of a Ukrainian advance in Severodonetsk, an invitation was sent out to the British news agency Reuters, and Reuters did indeed send its journalists to Severodonetsk. Some came from the Ukrainian side, some came from the the Donbass side. In both cases, they found the situation in Severodonetsk a case of extreme fighting going on. One gets the sense that they didn't want to stay there for very long. The Reuters journalists coming in from the Donbass side, their convoy was shelled, presumably by Ukrainian artillery. Some of their accompanying people were killed. The journalists themselves were injured. And the long and the short of it was that though the journalists from Reuters were able to confirm that the Ukrainians still had a presence in Severodonetsk, it was clear that fighting in the town was intense and that the town was heavily contested, and that they were not able to say how extensive Ukrainian control in Severodonetsk actually was. And in fact, we've now had a certain trickle of information from both Russian and Ukrainian sources, both, I want to stress, independent of the respective governments in Moscow and Kiev, and they've given us a better and clearer picture of what actually did happen in Severodonetsk. It seems that there was a Ukrainian counterattack. It seems that it did delay Russian advances into the Azot chemical factory, which may have been the actual intention, but it seems that the Ukrainians did not capture any new ground in the town, that in fact the front lines remained essentially where they were before the attack itself took place, and that in fact if the purpose of this attack was to recover ground in the city, in Severodonetsk, well, that attempt seems to have failed. And that, by the way, has been the consistent pattern of Ukrainian counterattacks and Ukrainian counteroffensives. As I've discussed many videos recently, the Kharkiv counteroffensive witnessed a brief advance from areas that the Russians had pulled out of, but it has now gone into reverse, and nearly all the territory that was briefly recaptured by Ukraine appears to have been lost or is in the process of being lost. The offensive in Kherson region that we were hearing so much about, well, you may have noticed if you're following the Western media that they've stopped talking about this great Ukrainian offensive in Kherson region. I gather that it was pushed back with very heavy losses. And in fact, there's now apparently lots of film coming out of the Russian side of on the Kherson Nikolayev front. Lots of films showing heavy Russian tanks and armored vehicles rumbling through Kherson city, giving the impression that after the failure of the Ukrainian counterattack and following very heavy Russian missile strikes on the neighboring Ukrainian city of Nikolayev, an important city, by the way, on the Black Sea, once site of a famous shipyard created by Catherine the Great, once the most important shipyard of the Russian Navy. Well, anyway, following heavy Russian missile strikes in Nikolayev, it looks as if the Russians may be preparing some kind of offensive of their own. Unlike the Ukrainians, the Russians don't talk at all about what they are intending to do. And of course, we can't be sure. It may be that these extra troops that the Russians have been sending to Kherson region are in anticipation of more Ukrainian attacks, and that they're intended to bolster the Russian defenses there. Who's to say? But anyway, it doesn't look as if that Kherson offensive, which, by the way, is the latest of a whole series of Kherson counteroffensives that the Ukrainians have talked about. It doesn't seem as if that Kherson offensive, up to this point, has achieved anything very much. And of course, it could be about to go into reverse. Anyway, that's the overall picture on all of these various fronts in terms of Ukrainian counteroffensives. Elsewhere, we hear of the Russians still advancing. They captured a town called Svyatogorsk. They've also occupied a very famous monastery, Russian Orthodox monastery, located near the town of Svyatogorsk. The Ukrainian forces briefly occupied it, and over the course of the fighting, there were pictures, dramatic pictures, of a wooden church at this monastery on fire. And of course, inevitably, the Ukrainians and the Russians traded accusations about who was responsible. I should quickly say that contrary to what some people are suggesting, this particular church, wooden church, which was on fire, is not a historic or important artistic part of this particular monastery. It actually dates from 2009. In other words, it's a very recent construction, and it was basically built by the former Ukrainian President Yanukovych. Of course, in 2009, he wasn't yet the president of Ukraine. He was about to become so, but he wasn't, I believe, president when this particular church was built in this monastery. But Donbass, Donetsk region was his power base, and clearly he wanted to build this church there in order to make a point about how committed he was to Donetsk and to Donbass, and to shore up his political and electoral support in Donetsk. So this fire, sad though it is not quite the cultural and artistic catastrophe that some people are reporting. Whoever was responsible, about which, by the way, as I am not on the ground, I'm not even going to try and guess. Anyway, elsewhere, as I said, Russians are still advancing through Donbass, and we've seen that these Ukrainian counteroffensives, well, in Severodonetsk, they may have slowed the Russian advance, but they've not managed to recapture any significant territory. And on the topic of Ukrainian counterattacks, we've had a very interesting point made by Jacob Dreisen, who you all know from the Dreisen report, but who also did a live stream on the Duran with myself and my colleague Alex Christoforou. And Jacob made the point that Ukraine, whenever it is trying to launch offensives or counteroffensives, in other words, deployed large numbers of troops, sending them forward into battle, those offensives have not gone at all well. Ukraine can launch minor counterattacks with small numbers of troops, perhaps battalion or brigade level, but when we're talking about large combined arms offensives, it has never been successful at any point during the 2014 to 15 fighting or in the fighting today. And Jacob Dreisen made the further point on that live stream that with the Russians dominating Ukraine's airspace, it would be extremely difficult for Ukraine to successfully launch counteroffensives or large-scale offensives anyway. The Russians would know exactly what they were doing. The troops would have to be concentrated. They'd be immediately susceptible to air attack by the Russian Air Force and by the Russian missile forces. And for the moment, that simply isn't an option. Meanwhile, we've now had a whole further cluster of reports from various Western sources. Firstly, there was a report in the Washington Post, unusual because, again, a Washington Post journalist managed to get to Severodonetsk. He describes a picture of a Ukrainian force there on the verge of collapse. That's basically his description. The volume of Russian artillery fire, which we've been talking about for many programs and which is now also discussed by all sorts of other people, the Moon of Alabama, Jacob Dreisen, the New Atlas, others. Lots of people have been talking about this enormous volume of artillery fire that the Russians are directing at the Ukrainian forces, have brought the Ukrainian forces in this part of the Donbass, in the Severodonetsk, Lysychansk conurbation, to the point of total collapse. And by the way, it turns out that claim that the Ukrainians were making yesterday, that they had recaptured 20% of Severodonetsk, was intended to contradict a British report that the Ukrainian forces in northern Donbass were about to collapse in about 2 weeks. Now, there's rumors, Der Spiegel talks about them, there's rumors that the German intelligence agency, the BND, is advising the German government that Ukraine's resistance will probably collapse within the next 5 weeks, and that Ukraine is likely to lose the whole of Donbass, certainly by the end of August. And if Ukrainian resistance collapses in Donbass, maybe it's going to collapse in other places as well. And there's been an exceptionally interesting video presentation by a member of the Austrian military, who also provides an overview of the fighting in Donbass. And he also seems to speak of a gathering crisis for Ukraine in Donbass. As the Moon of Alabama has pointed out, this Austrian commentary has also reported that the Ukrainians rushed to reinforce the Donbass front with 7 brigades of troops made up from the territorial defense. That would be around 20,000 men in total if these brigades are up to strength. Well, that corresponds with my impression that Ukrainian troops are becoming older and older as the battle continues, because the territorial defense is made up essentially of reservists, many of them in middle age, many of them no longer fully accustomed to using weapons, and not perhaps trained or prepared for this kind of battle. And it reinforces the impression that Ukraine has been feeding people into Donbass, trying to hold the line there and finding it increasingly difficult to do, and experiencing massive losses as it tries to hold on in Donbass. And 20,000 men thrown into a battle which is being lost, reinforcing failure, does seem to me an extraordinary misuse of resources. That's putting it in a rather cold-blooded way. A tragic loss and a massive breach of trust towards the soldiers, the reservists who are brought together in these brigades. Anyway, interestingly now, we've also had comments from President Putin about these HIMARS systems. And he's absolutely scathing about these. He doesn't seem to take them very seriously, but he makes these comments. He says this: "In my view, all this fuss over additional deliveries of armaments generally pursues the sole objective of stretching out the armed conflict as long as possible." And then he goes on to say that the deliveries of multiple launch rocket systems to Ukraine changes nothing, since Kiev previously had an inventory of these armaments, including rockets of this range, and is simply replenishing its stock. There is nothing new about that. That's Putin again. These are all multiple rocket launch systems, and the Ukrainian army operates similar Soviet and Russian-made Grad, Smerch and Uragan systems. And he then went on to say that the range of these systems depended on the rockets that are used and not on the system itself. What we hear today and what we understand is that these are rockets that fly to a distance of 45 to 70 kilometers, depending on the rocket type. The same is true about Grad, Uragan and Smerch rocket systems that I spoke about. They also have a range of 40 to 70 kilometers, and there is nothing new about that. That is why these deliveries by the United States and some other countries can only be related to the intention to help Kiev make up for its losses in combat hardware. And then Putin also talked about the assurances that Ukraine would not use them to carry out strikes on Russian territory, and he's incredibly cynical about these. He goes on to say there's nothing to do with trust or distrust for the Ukrainian regime, because this depends on the types of rockets that the Americans will supply. Now, part of them has been restored and some have been taken from inventories, and as we understand, they currently have about 360 such systems. We believe that's 360 systems in total, mainly Russian ones. We believe that the delivery of rocket systems by the United States and some other countries is related to making up for the losses of this combat hardware. There is nothing new about that, and this actually changes nothing. So he's not particularly fazed or alarmed by these rocket systems that the United States is supplying, and he seems fairly well informed about the extent of the rocket systems that Ukraine already possesses. I would add that there's been a long discussion in the London Times by a British general about the state of the Ukrainian armed forces, and the British general talks about a gathering collapse of morale amongst Ukrainian troops as they come under this massive Russian artillery fire. He seems skeptical, this British general seems skeptical that the West can supply enough artillery to make up the difference, to change the balance in terms of the enormous Russian artillery capabilities in Donbass. But perhaps more importantly, the British general makes the point that for Ukraine to integrate Western weapons into its arsenal effectively and to successfully launch counteroffensives against the Russians, Ukraine would need to restructure its entire military and reorganize its command and control systems and in effect change its existing command and control systems. Now, realistically, that is not going to happen, probably at all, but certainly not within the time frame that Ukraine still has. So it doesn't look terribly promising from the British General's point of view as to what is going to happen with Ukraine going forward. Now, I will briefly return to all those discussions that are now going on amongst the Western powers about trying to find some kind of negotiated solution to the Ukrainian problem. Now, the word that's going out is that Ukraine and Russia are in this long war of attrition, and that this is now starting to create concern in Washington and amongst Western capitals, and because it's depleting Western arsenals and prolonging the economic crisis, and that because this war of attrition is going to go on for a very long time, they're trying to find some way out to end the war of attrition. I'm afraid I don't take those claims seriously. What is driving the Western leaders towards seeking some kind of compromise with Moscow is, on the contrary, the fear that over the next few weeks and months, Ukraine will be defeated. The Russians will dictate terms, and the Western powers will find themselves dealing with a debacle. That is what is driving all these discussions. If they were confident that Ukraine could hold the line indefinitely, they would probably be more confident about waiting this thing out. On the contrary, it's because they fear that Ukraine is going to lose and lose soon, and that there is nothing that they can do to turn the situation round, that they're now frantically speaking and talking to each other about finding some kind of a solution. Well, as one particular website, Naked Capitalism, strange name, but very interesting site, by the way, has pointed out, the Western powers may have come to that realization, but they show no understanding or perhaps ability to accept the extent of the concessions that Ukraine and they themselves would have to make if they were going to bring that war to an end fast. Speaking for myself, I would say this: they need to come to that understanding very soon. Suggestions, proposals which leave, even nominally, places like Crimea and Donbass still part of Ukraine are simply not going to be acceptable to Moscow, even if they are supposed to lead eventually to some kind of situation where power is devolved by Ukraine to these regions. The time for that is long gone. There has to be an acceptance, not just in Kiev, but in Western capitals, that Ukraine is going to lose territory, and is going to lose a lot of territory, and that is the only basis upon which the Russians at this point might be prepared to talk. If they delay too long, then the risk is that the Russians will dictate terms. The West may find itself facing a settlement in Ukraine in which it has had no part to play, and which leaves Ukraine essentially under the Russian thumb, with large parts of its territory broken off from it, and in a situation where the Western powers might feel that they have no option but to keep the sanctions going, the economic war going indefinitely, despite the economic crisis in the West which it is causing, because to do otherwise and to accept this solution that the Russians might impose on Ukraine would be impossibly humiliating. So if that is a disaster that the Western powers want to avoid, they need to be realistic about the situation now. Well, that's all I'm going to say. As I said, this is a reasonably brief program. You can follow us again on Rumble and Locals and on other platforms, ODYSEE, Super U, and on Telegram. You can support us via Patreon and Subscribestar. You can also check out our shop, all the great things you will find there, magic mugs, hats, hoodies, t-shirts, sweatshirts, and all those things. And please also don't forget to check your subscription to this channel and to tick the like button to this video. Thank you for joining me again, and more from me soon.